The morning mist hung low over Red Willow, Wyoming, like a widow's veil draped across the sleeping town. Jack Rollins led his chestnut mare along the weathered fence posts, his boots leaving prints in the frost-touched dirt of the main road. Beside him, 4-year-old Sadie matched his pace with determined little steps, her breath forming small white puffs in the crisp autumn air. "Papa, why do the leaves turn yellow?" Sadie asked, pointing at the sycamore trees that lined the edge of town. "Same reason hair turns gray, little one," Jack replied, adjusting his worn hat against the early sun. "Everything's got its season." The town was barely stirring. A few shopkeepers swept their stoops, and somewhere a rooster crowed its delayed greeting to the dawn. Jack had risen early to check on a sick colt at the Hendersons' ranch, and Sadie, as always, insisted on accompanying him. Since Martha's passing 2 winters ago, the child rarely left his side. They were passing the cluster of sycamores near the old water trough when Jack's mare snorted and shied sideways. He steadied her with a gentle hand, then noticed what had spooked her: a burlap sack beneath the largest tree, too large and oddly shaped to contain feed or supplies. "Stay here, Sadie." Jack tied the mare's reins to a post and approached cautiously. The sack was stained dark along one side, and it moved barely, but unmistakably, his heart hammering. Jack knelt and carefully opened the coarse fabric. Inside lay a young woman, unconscious, her wrists bound with rope and her face bearing the purple shadows of harsh treatment. Blood had dried on a gash along her temple, matting her dark hair. "Dear God," Jack breathed. He quickly checked for a pulse, weak but steady. The girl couldn't be more than 20, her dress torn and dirty, feet bare and bloodied. "Papa." Sadie had crept closer, peering around his shoulder. "Go to Mrs. Morrison's house," Jack said firmly. "Tell her to bring water and clean cloths." But Sadie stood frozen, staring at the unconscious woman. Her small hand reached out, then pulled back. "Papa," she whispered, her voice strange and wondering. "Papa, she's Mama." Jack's hand stilled on the rope he was untying. He looked at his daughter's face, those earnest brown eyes that were so like Martha's, and saw something he couldn't quite name. Not confusion, but a kind of recognition that made no earthly sense. "Sadie, honey, that's not—" "She's Mama?" Sadie repeated, more certain now, reaching out to touch the woman's hand. Before Jack could respond, voices arose from the street. Tom Harmon, the deputy sheriff, strode over with 2 other men, their faces hard with suspicion. "What have you got there, Rollins?" Harmon's hand rested on his pistol. "Heard there was trouble at the county line last night. Stage got robbed." "Found her in this sack," Jack said evenly. "She's hurt bad, been tied up and left to die." "Could be she's one of them that done it," suggested Will Patterson, the banker. "Could be they had a falling out." Jack lifted the unconscious woman carefully, cradling her against his chest. "Could be she's a human being who needs help." "Now hold on," Harmon stepped forward. "That's a matter for the law to decide. You can't just—" "I can and I will." Jack's voice carried the quiet authority of a man who'd made his decision. "She'll be at my place when you want to ask your questions, after she's been tended to." The crowd that had gathered murmured uneasily. In a town like Red Willow, taking in a stranger, especially a woman found in such circumstances, invited all manner of speculation and trouble. Mrs. Morrison, a stout woman with kind eyes, pushed through with an armful of supplies. "The barn's warmest," she said to Jack, ignoring the men entirely. "That old stove of yours still works." Jack nodded gratefully and started walking, Sadie clutching his coat. "Behind them," Harmon called out. "This ain't over. Rollins, law's got to be satisfied." "Then satisfy it," Jack replied without turning, "but not at the cost of a life." In the barn, Jack laid the woman on a bed of clean straw covered with horse blankets. Mrs. Morrison worked efficiently, cleaning wounds and checking for broken bones while Jack built up the fire in the pot-bellied stove. Sadie stood guard at the door like a tiny sentinel. "No fever yet, that's good." "Mrs.," Morrison murmured. "But these rope marks. Whoever did this meant for her to stay put." She looked at Jack meaningfully. "You sure you want this trouble?" Jack glanced at Sadie, who had moved to sit beside the unconscious woman, holding her hand with both of her small ones. "Seems like the trouble's already decided for me." "Mrs." Morrison gathered her things. "I'll check back this evening. Try to get some water in her when she wakes. And Jack," she paused at the door. "Martha would be proud." After she left, Jack sat on an overturned bucket, watching his daughter stroke the stranger's hair with gentle fingers. The morning light slanted through the barn slats, painting golden stripes across the scene. "Why did you say that, Sadie?" he asked quietly. "About her being your mama?" Sadie looked up at him with those two wise eyes. "Don't know. Papa just felt it here." She placed a hand over her heart. "Like when I smell Mama's lavender soap, or when you play her favorite hymn. She feels like that." Jack had no answer for that. He'd learned long ago that children sometimes saw truths that adults' eyes had grown too clouded to perceive. Instead, he fetched water and began the patient work of dropping it between the woman's cracked lips, a few drops at a time. The sun climbed higher, and the barn grew warm. The woman stirred occasionally, murmuring words too soft to catch. Her face, cleaned of dirt and blood, revealed fine features and an underlying strength despite her current state. "She's pretty," Sadie observed. "Prettier than the schoolteacher." "Hush now," Jack said, but gently. Near noon, Tom Harmon appeared in the doorway, backlit by harsh sunlight. "Rollins, need to ask some questions." "Ask away." Jack didn't move from his position beside the makeshift bed. "Got word from Cheyenne. They're looking for a woman. Fits the description." "What'd she do?" Harmon shifted uncomfortably. "Don't rightly know yet, just that she's wanted for questioning." "Well, when she wakes up and can answer, I'll let you know." Jack's tone made it clear the conversation was over. Harmon's face darkened. "Don't make me come back with a warrant." "Do what you have to do, Tom, just like I'm doing." After Harmon left, Jack found himself studying the woman's face. Who was she? What had driven someone to treat another human being like a refuse to be discarded? And why did his daughter, his practical, sensible daughter, insist on calling her Mama? As if sensing his thoughts, the woman's eyelids fluttered. Her eyes opened briefly, unfocused and frightened, before closing again. But in that moment, Jack saw something that made his breath catch a depth of pain that spoke of more than physical wounds. "It's all right," he heard himself saying. "You're safe now." Sadie scooted closer, her small body radiating the fierce protectiveness of a child who'd already lost one mother. "We'll take care of you," she whispered to the sleeping woman. "Papa's good at fixing broken things. He fixed my doll in the chicken coop, and Mr. Henderson's wagon wheel, he can fix you too." Jack felt his throat tighten. In the 2 years since Martha's death, he'd held his small family together through sheer will and routine. Now this stranger had appeared, literally thrown away like garbage. And somehow she'd already begun to shift something fundamental in their carefully ordered world. Outside, he could hear the town going about its business wheels creaking, horses neighing, the distant ring of the blacksmith's hammer. But inside the barn, in this pocket of warmth and quiet, time seemed suspended. He thought of Martha, how she'd always insisted on leaving a lamp burning on the coldest nights in case a traveler needed shelter. "The light calls to the lost," she used to say. Maybe that's what Sadie had recognized, not the woman herself, but the need for someone to fill that space of caring, that lamp left burning. The woman stirred again, and this time her eyes opened fully. They were gray, the color of morning mist, and they held his for a long moment before sliding to Sadie. "Hello," Sadie said simply. "I'm Sadie. This is my papa. You're safe now." The woman's lips moved, but no sound came. Jack quickly brought water, supporting her head while she sipped. when she finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse as old rope. Where am I? Red Willow, Wyoming, Jack answered. I'm Jack Rollins. This is my daughter. We found you this morning. Fear flickered across her features. Did they follow? Who did this to you? But she was already fading back into unconsciousness, her body choosing healing over questions. Jack settled her head gently on the folded blanket that served as a pillow. Papa, Sadie said thoughtfully. She needs a name. We can't just call her the lady. Jack considered. In the filtered sunlight, with her dark hair spread across the pale blanket, she looked fragile as a bird. But there was something else too, a quality of endurance, like a flower that blooms despite the drought. What do you think? He asked his daughter. Sadie studied the sleeping woman with serious concentration. She looks like a rose, but stronger, like the wild roses that grow by the creek, the ones with thorns. Rose it is, then, Jack agreed, until she woke and could tell them different. She would be their rose, their wild rose found among the thorns of cruelty, waiting to bloom again. As the afternoon wore on, Jack found himself thinking about the sack, about the kind of person who could tie up another human being and leave them to die. The West was hard country, no doubt about it. It made some folks harder than they needed to be. But it also had a way of revealing what people were made of, stripping away pretense like wind stripping paint from old wood. He'd made his choice the moment he'd opened that sack. Whatever came next, Harmon's questions, the town's gossip, the danger that might follow this woman like a shadow, he'd face it. Because sometimes doing right wasn't about being safe or smart. Sometimes it was about being human. Sadie had fallen asleep beside their patient, one small hand still clasping Rose's larger one. Jack covered them both with his coat and settled in to watch. Outside, the autumn sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. But for now, in this quiet barn with its smell of hay and horses and the soft breathing of two souls finding rest, Jack Rollins allowed himself a moment of something he hadn't felt in 2 years, the possibility of hope. The woman's eyes opened slowly in the amber light of late afternoon. Jack noticed first he'd been watching for any sign of true waking while Sadie helped him sort dried beans at the rough table near the stove. "Water," came the whispered request. Jack brought the tin cup to her lips, supporting her head carefully. She drank in small, painful sips, her gray eyes never leaving his face. "What's your name?" he asked gently when she'd finished. Confusion clouded her features. She opened her mouth, closed it, then shook her head slightly. I don't—" Panic began to rise in her eyes. "I can't remember. Why can't I remember?" "Easy now," Jack soothed. "You took a bad knock to the head. Sometimes that muddles things for a while." Sadie had abandoned the beans and now stood beside the makeshift bed, studying their guest with that peculiar intensity children possessed. "We'll call you Rose," she announced. "Like the wild roses by the creek. Papa said it was all right." The woman's gaze shifted to the child, and something softened in her expression. "Rose," she repeated, testing the name. I suppose that will do." "Do you remember anything?" Jack asked. "Anything at all?" Rose closed her eyes, concentrating. "Running. I remember running. And fear. So much fear." Her eyes snapped open. "They'll come looking. Whoever did this, they'll come looking." "Let them come," Jack said quietly. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." A knock at the barn door interrupted them. Tom Harmon entered without waiting for permission, followed by Judge McKay and 2 other townsmen Jack recognized as members of the town council. "Rollins," the judge said, his voice carrying the weight of authority. "We need to discuss this situation." Jack stood, placing himself between the men and Rose. "Nothing to discuss. She's hurt and needs care." "That may be," Harmon interjected. "But we've got responsibilities to this town. We don't know who she is or what she's done." "What I see," Jack replied evenly, "is a woman who was tied up, beaten, and left to die. That tells me all I need to know about who the real criminals are." Judge McKay stroked his gray beard thoughtfully. "Be that as it may, we can't have you harboring potential fugitives. It sets a dangerous precedent." "She ain't going nowhere," Sadie piped up, moving to stand beside Rose's bed with her small arms crossed. "She's staying with us." The men exchanged uncomfortable glances. It was one thing to argue with Jack Rollins, another entirely to face down a determined 4-year-old. Perhaps a compromise. The judge suggested. "The lady stays here for now, but under supervision. Someone from the town council will check in daily, and as soon as she's well enough, she'll need to answer questions." Jack nodded slowly. "Fair enough, but the questions wait until she's healed." After the men left, Rose struggled to sit up. "I'm causing you trouble. I should go." "You should rest," Jack countered, gently pressing her back down. "Trouble's been scratching at my door long before you arrived. At least this time it's for a good cause." Over the next days, a routine developed. Jack would tend to his horses and ranch work in the early morning, then return to check on Rose, Mrs. Morrison came by twice daily to help with nursing duties, clucking her tongue at the extensive bruising revealed as Rose healed. "Whoever done this wasn't just angry," she confided to Jack one evening. "This was calculated, meant to send a message." Rose grew stronger, though her memory remained frustratingly blank. She could recall skills: how to mend a tear in fabric, how to read, how to brew tea, but nothing personal. No family, no home, no name beyond the one Sadie had given her. The child, for her part, had appointed herself Rose's guardian and companion. She would sit for hours beside the bed, chattering about everything and nothing: the barn cats, the shapes of clouds, how Papa made the best flapjacks but always burned the edges. "My mama used to sing," Sadie told Rose one afternoon. "She'd sing while she worked. Pretty songs about birds and flowers. Do you know any songs?" Rose's brow furrowed. Then, unexpectedly, she began to hum a low, sweet melody that seemed to surprise her as much as her listeners. I remember that," she whispered. "Someone used to sing it to me. Someone who loved me." It was the first concrete memory she'd recovered, and Jack saw hope bloom in her eyes like spring after a hard winter. The townspeople's reactions varied wildly. Some, like Mrs. Morrison and the minister's wife, brought food and offers of help. Others crossed the street when they saw Jack coming, whispering behind raised hands. The story grew in the telling she was a saloon girl run afoul of her employer, a thief who'd betrayed her partners, a wealthy man's mistress fleeing scandal. "Don't let it trouble you," Jack told Rose one evening as they heard yet another cluster of gossips outside the barn. "People fear what they don't understand." "But I don't understand either," Rose replied softly. "What if they're right? What if I am someone terrible?" Jack considered his words carefully. He'd been thinking about this himself, watching her these past days, the way she handled Sadie with instinctive gentleness, how she'd tried to help with chores despite her weakness. The tears that came to her eyes when she thought no one was looking. "I've known bad people," he said finally. "Real bad. And whatever you might have done or been, that ain't what you are. Bad doesn't rest in a person's bones like what I see in you." Rose's eyes glistened. "How can you be so sure?" "Because my daughter knows things," Jack said simply. "And she knew you from the first moment. That's enough for me." As if summoned by her name, Sadie burst through the door carrying a handful of late wildflowers. "For you," she announced, presenting them to Rose with a flourish, "to make the barn pretty." While Rose and Sadie arranged the flowers in an empty preserve jar, Jack noticed Deputy Harmon approaching. The man's expression was grim. "Need a word. Rollins. Private-like." Jack stepped outside, closing the door behind him. "What is it?" "Got a wire from Cheyenne. There's a man coming name of Silas Brandt. Says he's looking for someone. Description matches your guest." "What's his business with her?" Harmon shrugged. Didn't say, but he's got papers, legal papers. Judge says we got to cooperate. Jack felt his jaw tighten. When? Tomorrow. Maybe day after. Jack. Harmon's voice softened slightly. I know you mean well, but this might be bigger than you bargained for. Maybe it'd be best if... If what? If I threw her out, handed her over to the first man who comes claiming ownership? Jack's voice was dangerously quiet. That what you'd do? Tom, that what you'd want someone to do if it was your daughter lying in that barn? Harmon had no answer for that. That night, Jack sat up late, cleaning his rifle and thinking. The lamp cast long shadows across the barn walls, and he could hear Rose's peaceful breathing from where she slept. Sadie had insisted on staying too, curled up like a kitten beside Rose's bed. He thought about Martha, about the life they'd built together before the fever took her. She'd always said he had too much faith in people, that his soft heart would be his downfall. But she'd smiled when she said it, the way you smile at something you love despite its flaws. What would you do? Martha, he whispered to the darkness, but he already knew. Martha would have done exactly what he was doing, standing between the helpless and harm, no matter the cost. The next morning brought clouds heavy with the promise of rain. Jack was mucking out stalls when Rose appeared in the doorway, leaning heavily against the frame. She'd dressed in one of Martha's old work dresses that Mrs. Morrison had brought, and though it hung loose on her frame, she looked stronger than she had since her arrival. You shouldn't be up, Jack said, moving to steady her. I heard, she said quietly, about the man coming. I won't bring trouble to you and Sadie. I'll leave tonight. You'll do no such thing. Jack, may I call you Jack? At his nod, she continued. You've been kinder than I had any right to expect, but I can feel it something dark in my past. I won't let it touch your daughter. Before Jack could respond, Sadie appeared, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She took in Rose standing, dressed and obviously planning something, and her small face set in stubborn lines. No, she said firmly. You're not leaving. Tell her, Papa. Jack knelt beside his daughter. Sadie, honey. No. Tears sprang to the child's eyes. She's supposed to stay. She's supposed to be our family. You promised Mama we'd be all right, and we're not all right without her. The barn fell silent, except for Sadie's hiccuping sobs. Rose moved carefully to kneel beside the little girl, wincing at the movement. Oh, sweetheart, she murmured, gathering Sadie into her arms. I'm not trying to hurt you. I'm trying to protect you. That's what Mama said. Sadie whispered into Rose's shoulder. Before she went to heaven, she said she had to go to protect us from being sad forever. But it didn't work. We were sad anyway. Jack felt his throat close. He hadn't known Martha had said that to Sadie, hadn't known his daughter carried that weight. Rose held Sadie tighter, her own tears falling now. Sometimes protecting people means staying and fighting for them, doesn't it? Sadie pulled back to look at her seriously. Yes, that's what Papa does. He stays and fights, even when the horses are scared, even when the storms come. Rose looked up at Jack, question and promise mingling in her gray eyes. Then I'll stay. Whatever comes, I'll stay and face it. Jack nodded, not trusting his voice. He reached out and pulled both of them into an embrace, his daughter and this woman who'd appeared in their lives like a gift wrapped in thorns. Outside, thunder rumbled in the distance. Change was coming. Jack could feel it, but for now, in this circle of arms and determined hearts, they had something stronger than memory or fear. They had chosen each other. The rest of the day passed in quiet preparation. Jack reinforced the barn doors and checked his ammunition. Rose helped Sadie with her letters. The two heads bent close over the child's primer. To anyone looking in, they might have seemed an ordinary family weathering an ordinary day. But Jack knew better. Tomorrow would bring this Silas Brandt with his papers and claims. Tomorrow would bring questions Rose couldn't answer and dangers they couldn't yet see. Tonight, though, they had peace. They had soup warming on the stove and Sadie's laughter as Rose taught her a clapping game. They had the soft rain beginning to fall on the barn roof and the warmth of the fire holding back the dark. "Jack," Rose said softly after Sadie had fallen asleep, "whatever I was before, whoever I was, I want you to know that this here, now this is who I choose to be." "I know," Jack replied. "So do I." They sat in companionable silence, watching the fire burn low. Two people who'd found something worth defending in the wreckage of their separate losses. Outside, Red Willow slept uneasily, waiting for tomorrow's reckoning. But inside the barn, with its circle of lamplight and its fragile, fierce hope, a new family continued the delicate work of becoming. The morning sun painted the pasture gold as Jack led Clover, his gentlest mare, from the stable. Rose stood uncertainly by the fence, wearing Martha's old riding skirt and a borrowed shirt that still smelled faintly of lavender soap. "Never learned to ride?" Jack asked, though her nervous stance had already given her away. I'm not sure." Rose approached the horse cautiously. "My hands seem to know things my mind doesn't, but horses—" She shook her head. "Clover here's taught more folks to ride than any horse in the county," Jack said, stroking the mare's neck. "She's got more patience than a saint and moves like she's carrying eggs." Sadie sat perched on the fence, swinging her legs. Mama was scared of horses too, at first, but Papa taught her, and then she could ride faster than anybody. Rose smiled at the child, then took a deep breath and stepped closer to Clover. The mare turned her head, liquid brown eyes studying the newcomer with calm interest. "Let her smell you first," Jack instructed. "Horses need to know you before they trust you." Rose extended her hand tentatively. Clover snuffled at her palm, whiskers tickling, then gave a soft whicker of approval. "See, she likes you." Jack moved to stand beside Rose, close enough to steady her if needed, but not so close as to crowd. "Now, put your hand on her neck. Feel how calm she is, that's what you want to match." For the next hour, Jack walked them in slow circles around the pasture, Rose on Clover's back. Tense at first, gradually relaxing as the mare's steady gait worked its magic. Jack held the lead rope, talking quietly about balance and breathing, while Sadie offered encouragement from her fence perch. "You're doing fine," Jack said as Rose managed to guide Clover around a barrel without his help. "Natural as breathing. It does feel—" Rose paused, searching for words. "Familiar. Not the riding exactly, but this being outdoors, moving, feeling the sun." A shadow crossed her face. "I think I was kept inside for a long time, somewhere dark." Jack's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice easy. "Well, you're out now. That's what matters." They worked until the sun climbed high, then took a break in the shade of the old cottonwood. Mrs. Morrison had sent a lunch basket, cold chicken, bread, and the last of the season's apples. They spread a blanket and ate like a family on a Sunday picnic. "Papa, can we show Rose the creek?" Sadie asked, her mouth full of apple. "Don't talk with food in your mouth, little one," Jack corrected gently. "And yes, if Rose feels up to it." The creek ran clear and cold a quarter-mile from the house, bordered by willows and the wild roses that had given Rose her temporary name. Sadie immediately began hunting for pretty stones, while Rose sat on a fallen log, watching the water flow. "It's so peaceful," she murmured. "Like the world can't touch this place." Jack settled beside her, leaving a proper distance between them. "Martha used to say the same thing, said the creek knew how to keep secrets." Rose turned to study him. "You loved her very much." "I did, still do. I suppose love doesn't stop just because someone's gone." "No," Rose agreed softly. "It doesn't." She was quiet for a moment, then added, "I think someone loved me once. I can feel it sometimes, like warmth just out of reach." A splash interrupted them as Sadie slipped on a wet rock. Jack jumped up, but the girl was already laughing, soaked only to her knees. "I'm all right. Papa, look what I found. She held up a piece of quartz that caught the light like captured starfire. That's a keeper, Rose called, and Sadie beamed. They spent the afternoon by the creek, Sadie building tiny dams while the adults talked quietly about small things the coming winter. The best way to preserve late vegetables. Whether the Anderson boy would finally work up the courage to court the minister's daughter. Safe topics that skirted around the larger questions hanging over them. As the shadows lengthened, they headed back. Rose walked beside Clover now, one hand on the mare's neck, moving with new confidence. Halfway home, she suddenly stopped, her face draining of color. Rose, Jack moved quickly to her side. She gripped Clover's mane, eyes unfocused. Laughing, I remember laughing, a man's voice saying, you ride like you were born in the saddle, little bird. And feeling safe, completely safe. She blinked, focusing on Jack's concerned face. Then darkness, shouting, being dragged away from... She shook her head sharply. It's gone. That's enough for today, Jack said firmly, seeing her trembling. Memories like a spooked horse chase it too hard and it'll just run further. That evening, after supper and Sadie's bedtime story, Jack found Rose sitting outside the barn, wrapped in a shawl, staring at the stars. Mind if I join you? She shifted to make room on the bench he'd built years ago for Martha. I remembered something else. My hands. She held them up in the lamplight spilling from the barn. They had calluses once, from work, real work. These soft things aren't mine. Jack looked at her hands pale and unmarked except for the healing rope burns on her wrists. Lots of reasons a person's hands might change. Being kept prisoner is one of them, Rose said quietly. That's what I was, wasn't I? That's why I can't remember they kept me somewhere. Did something to me. Tried to make me forget who I was. Maybe so, Jack allowed. But they failed. You're here. You're free. You're remembering. Rose turned to look at him. Why are you so kind to me, really? It can't just be Christian charity. Jack considered the question, looking out at the star-scattered sky. My PA used to tell me that a man's measure wasn't in what he owned or what he achieved, but in what he did when he found someone in need. Said the world was full of people walking past other folks suffering, making excuses about why it wasn't their problem. But there's more. Rose pressed gently. Isn't there? Jack nodded slowly. When Martha died, I thought about giving up, sending Sadie to her aunt in St. Louis, selling the ranch, just disappearing, but I couldn't do it. She'd have been so disappointed in me. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Then you appeared, literally thrown away like garbage, and Sadie looked at you and saw hope. How could I turn away from that? How could I tell my daughter that hope wasn't worth fighting for? She really believes I'm meant to be her mother, Rose said wonderingly. Sadie sees things simple, Jack replied. She needed a mother. You appeared needing a family. In her mind, that's God's arithmetic. And in yours, Jack turned to meet her eyes. I think sometimes broken people find each other, not to fix each other, but to make something new from the pieces. The moment stretched between them, full of possibility and fear in equal measure. Then Rose smiled the first full, unguarded smile he'd seen from her. I'd like that, she said simply, making something new. A coyote howled in the distance, and they both turned toward the sound. The wild was never far away in Wyoming, Jack reflected. Neither was danger. Tomorrow was still coming with its threats and revelations. But tonight, he'd watched a frightened woman find her balance on horseback. He'd seen his daughter laugh by the creek. He'd felt the stirring of something in his chest that wasn't quite hope, but was closer to it than he'd been in 2 years. We should go in, he said finally. Early morning tomorrow. Rose stood, then paused. Jack, that man who called me Little Bird, I think he was my father. I think he taught me to ride, to work, to be strong, and I think something terrible happened to him. We'll find out, Jack promised. Whatever the truth is, We'll face it together." She nodded and walked back to the barn, her step steadier than it had been that morning. Jack stayed a moment longer, looking at the stars Martha had loved to name for Sadie. "I'm trying," he whispered to the night. "I'm trying to do right by them both." The wind carried no answer, but he hadn't expected one. Martha's answers had always come in morning sunlight and afternoon laughter, in the small miracles of daily life carrying on despite loss. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight had brought its own gifts, a woman learning to trust her own strength again, a child's faith bearing fruit, and the first fragile threads of a new family weaving themselves together under the vast Wyoming sky. Jack stood, stretched muscles sore from the day's work, and headed inside. In the barn, he could hear Rose's soft voice singing Sadie to sleep, the same melody she'd remembered days ago, now given words about stars and flowers and birds flying home. He paused in the doorway, watching them in the lamplight, the lost woman and the motherless child, finding in each other what they'd thought forever gone. It wasn't the family he'd planned or the life he'd expected, but as Sadie would say, sometimes God's arithmetic didn't match human figuring. Sometimes it was better. The knock came at midnight, sharp and deliberate against the barn door. Jack sat up from his bedroll, instantly alert. Across the room, Rose stirred on her cot while Sadie remained deeply asleep beside her. 3 more knocks, measured and patient. This wasn't a neighbor in need. Jack pulled on his boots and shirt, checking the rifle by the door before opening it a crack. A tall man stood in the moonlight, his features shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. The silver badge on his vest caught the light like a cold star. Jack Rollins. The voice was cultured, with a slight accent Jack couldn't place. "My name is Darius Finch. I'm a detective from Cheyenne. I believe you're harboring someone I'm looking for." "It's late, Mr. Finch," Jack replied evenly, not opening the door wider. "Whatever business you have can wait for daylight." Finch smiled thinly. "I'm afraid it can't. The woman you've taken in, she's wanted in connection with a fire at the Hollow Creek Children's Home. 2 children died in that fire." Behind Jack, he heard Rose's sharp intake of breath. He kept his expression neutral. "That's a serious accusation. You have proof." "I have witness statements. I have a warrant. And I have jurisdiction." Finch's hand moved to rest on his sidearm. "Now, Mr. Rollins, I'd prefer to do this peacefully." "As would I," Jack said. "Which is why you'll come back tomorrow, in daylight, with the sheriff present. You'll show your papers to Judge McKay, and we'll handle this proper. This isn't some lawless territory where men with badges take what they want in the dark." Finch's eyes narrowed. "You're interfering with a legal investigation." "I'm insisting on due process." Jack countered, "If your case is solid, it'll keep until morning." For a long moment, the 2 men stared at each other. Then Finch stepped back, touching his hat brim mockingly. "Tomorrow then, dawn. Don't think about running, I'll be watching." Jack closed and barred the door, his heart racing. When he turned, Rose was sitting up, her face pale as moonlight through the window. "2 children, she whispered. "He said 2 children died." "He said a lot of things," Jack replied carefully. "Doesn't make them true." "But what if—" Rose's voice broke. "What if I did start that fire? What if I'm responsible?" Sadie sat up, rubbing her eyes. "What's wrong? Why is everyone awake?" "Just a late visitor, sweetheart," Jack said, moving to tuck her back in. "Nothing to worry about." But Sadie was fully awake now, her child's intuition sensing the fear in the room. "Is someone trying to take Rose away?" Jack hesitated, then nodded. "Someone wants to ask her questions, but we won't let anything bad happen." Sadie's face set in stubborn lines. She climbed out of bed and went to Rose, wrapping her small arms around the woman's waist. "You can't go. You promised to stay." Rose held the child close, tears sliding down her cheeks. "Oh, sweet girl. Sometimes promises—" "No," Sadie interrupted fiercely. "You promised. Papa promised. We're a family now. Families don't leave. Jack watched them, his daughter fierce as a small lioness. Rose trembling but holding on, and made his decision. Get dressed, he said quietly. Both of you, we're leaving. Jack, no, Rose protested. You can't throw away your life for me. This is your home, your ranch. It's just land and buildings, Jack interrupted. You two are what matters now. Get dressed. We've got maybe an hour before he realizes we're running. They moved quickly and quietly. Jack saddled 3 horses, Clover for Rose, his steady gelding Ranger, and Buttercup, the gentle pony for Sadie. He packed saddlebags with food, water, ammunition, and what money he had saved. Rose helped Sadie dress warmly while gathering their few possessions. Where will we go? Rose asked as Jack helped her mount Clover. There's a line shack up in the hills, Jack replied, lifting Sadie onto Buttercup's back. We can shelter there while I figure out our next move. I've got a friend in Montana who might... A shot rang out, splintering the barn door. Finch's voice carried through the night. That's far enough. Rollins, come out now. All of you. The horses danced nervously. Jack drew his rifle, calculating. The moon was behind clouds now if they could make it to the tree line. Papa, I'm scared, Sadie whimpered. I know, baby, but remember what I taught you about riding at night. Trust your pony and hold tight. Jack looked at Rose. Can you ride hard? She nodded, jaw set with determination. I think I'm about to remember how. On 3, Jack said. Ride for the cottonwoods and don't stop. 3, 2, 1, go. They burst from the barn in a thunder of hooves. More shots rang out behind them, but Finch was shooting blind in the darkness. Jack led them at a gallop across the familiar field, trusting his knowledge of the land. Behind them, shouts and the sound of pursuit. But Finch hadn't expected them to run. He wasn't mounted, would have to saddle up. It gave them precious minutes. They reached the cottonwoods and plunged into the deeper darkness beneath the trees. Jack slowed their pace, mindful of low branches and roots. Sadie rode like she was born to it, leaning low over Buttercup's neck. Rose had found her seat, moving with Clover as if the horse's rhythm had awakened some dormant muscle memory. They climbed steadily into the foothills, the sounds of pursuit fading. The horses were breathing hard by the time Jack called a halt by a small stream. We'll rest the horses for a few minutes, he said, dismounting to check their back trail. No signs of followers yet, but they'd come. Rose slid from Clover's back, immediately going to check on Sadie. You were so brave, she told the girl. I wasn't brave, Sadie said matter-of-factly. I was scared. But Papa says being brave means doing what needs doing even when you're scared. In the darkness, Jack smiled grimly. His daughter understood more than most children her age, maybe too much. They pushed on as the eastern sky began to lighten. The line shack appeared just as true dawn broke, a small, sturdy structure built into the hillside, invisible unless you knew where to look. Jack helped Rose and Sadie inside while he tended the horses. The shack was basic but clean, with a stove, bunks, and supplies laid in for winter emergencies. He'd maintained it faithfully, never knowing it might serve as refuge for his own family. When he entered, he found Rose trying to light the stove with shaking hands. He gently took the matches from her. Let me, he said softly. I've ruined everything, she whispered. Your home, your reputation, Sadie's safety. Stop, Jack turned to face her. You've ruined nothing. Whatever happened at that orphanage, whatever the truth is. I know one thing, you're not a killer. Not of children, not of anyone. How can you know that? Because I've seen you with Sadie. Because of how you tried to leave to protect us. Because, he paused, then continued more quietly. Because I trust my gut, and my gut says you're one of the good ones. Rose, whatever your past holds, that's what you are now. The stove caught, warmth beginning to fill the small space. Sadie had curled up on one of the bunks, exhaustion finally claiming her. Jack covered her with a thick blanket. "She's lucky to have you," Rose said, watching them. "We're lucky to have you," Jack corrected, then more seriously. "What do you remember about the fire?" Rose sank onto the other bunk, pressing her palms against her eyes. "Fragments, smoke, screaming, trying to get to the children's wing but being held back. Someone saying it was too late, that it was my fault for—" She stopped, frowning. "For finding the ledgers, for asking questions." Ledgers, records, hidden records about children who'd been sold, traded, I can't quite... She gasped suddenly, a memory surfacing clear and sharp. "There was a man, Mr. Garrett. He ran the orphanage. He was selling children to work camps, to brothels, calling it adoption. I found proof. I was going to the authorities. But he found out first." "So he silenced you," Jack said grimly. "Made you the scapegoat for a fire he probably set himself." "The children who died," Rose's voice broke, "were victims of his crimes, not yours." Jack finished firmly. "Rose, you were trying to save them. That's why you were targeted." She looked up at him, hope and despair warring in her gray eyes. "But how do we prove it? Finch has his warrant. His witnesses probably all bought and paid for by Garrett." Jack sat beside her, careful to maintain proper distance. "We find those ledgers. You said you hid them." I think so. Outside the orphanage somewhere. Under a sycamore tree." Her eyes widened. "Like where you found me. Jack, I was trying to get back to them. That's why I was near that tree." "Then that's where we start," Jack decided. "But first, we rest. We're safe here for now." As if to mock his words. The sound of horses approached outside. Jack grabbed his rifle, motioning for Rose to stay down. He peered through the small window. 3 riders. But as they drew closer, Jack relaxed slightly. "It's Tom Harmon," he said. "And the minister. And that's Mrs. Morrison's nephew, Billy." He stepped outside, rifle lowered but ready. "Tom!" The deputy sheriff dismounted slowly, hands visible. "Jack, figured you might head this way." He looked tired, older than his years. "That Finch fellow's got half the town in an uproar. Says you're harboring a dangerous criminal. And you believe him?" Tom spat tobacco juice. "I believe a man who comes skulking around at midnight ain't interested in justice. I believe a man who threatens to burn down barns to flush out fugitives ain't no real lawman. And I believe—" He paused, meeting Jack's eyes. "I believe you're a good judge of character. Jack Rollins. Always have been." The minister, Reverend Carter, stepped forward. "We've come to help. Jack, that woman in there, Rose, she came to the church the other day when you were in town. Prayed for near an hour. That's not the behavior of a guilty conscience. That's someone seeking strength to bear a heavy burden." Billy, barely 20 and eager, added, "My aunt says to tell you she's watching Finch. Says he won't sneeze without her knowing about it." Jack felt something ease in his chest. "I appreciate this. All of it. But I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," Tom interrupted. "We're offering now. What's the plan?" Inside the shack, Rose had heard everything. She stood in the doorway now, Sadie's hand in hers. "The plan is, I tell the truth," she said clearly. "All of it. And we get the evidence to prove it." Tom studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right then. Billy, you ride back to town. Keep an eye on Finch. Reverend, you might want to send some telegrams to your colleagues in Cheyenne. See what they know about this Hollow Creek place. I'll stay here with Jack. Make sure nobody disturbs their rest." As the men dispersed to their tasks, Jack found himself standing beside Rose as she watched the sunrise paint the mountains gold. "I'm starting to remember more," she said quietly. "My name, my real name. It's Rebecca. Rebecca Hartley. My father was a doctor. He died trying to expose what was happening at Hollow Creek. They killed him and took me, tried to make me disappear. Rebecca, Jack repeated, tasting the name. Do you want us to call you that now? She considered, then shook her head. Rose is who I became when you saved me. Rose is who Sadie sees as her mother. I think I'd like to stay Rose. Then Rose you are. Jack agreed. He hesitated, then added, We're going to get through this. All of us. Rose turned to look at him, and for a moment the rising sun lit her face like a benediction. I believe you, she said simply. For the first time in so long, I believe good might actually win. From inside the shack, Sadie's voice called out sleepily. Mama, Papa, is it morning? The word Papa was familiar, expected, but Mama that was new, tentative, hopeful. Rose's eyes filled with tears. Yes, sweetheart, she called back. It's morning, a new day. And despite everything, despite Finch and his threats, despite the danger still lurking, despite the uncertain future, Jack found himself believing it too. They would face whatever came. They would find the truth and fight for it. Because sometimes, in the wild territories of the heart, justice wore no badge but love, and the most unlikely families were the ones worth fighting hardest to protect. The fire in the line shack stove had burned low when Rose began to speak, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. Jack sat across from her at the rough wooden table, while Sadie dozed on the bunk, worn out from their night flight. I was 10 when they brought me to Hollow Creek, Rose began, staring into her cup of coffee as if the dark liquid held her memories. My father had just died, Dr. Marcus Hartley. He'd been investigating the orphanage after several children from his practice disappeared. One day he was healthy, the next... She swallowed hard. They said it was cholera, but there was no outbreak, no other cases. Jack remained silent, letting her find her own pace. I had no other family, so they took me to Hollow Creek, said it was for my own good. A bitter smile touched her lips. Mr. Garrett, the superintendent, he knew who I was, whose daughter I was. He kept me close, made sure I understood that asking questions like my father had would be unwise. But you asked anyway, Jack said quietly. Rose nodded. For 7 years, I kept quiet, kept my head down, but children kept disappearing. They'd tell us they were adopted, gone to good families, but sometimes I'd see the wagon that took them. It went east, toward the mining camps, not toward any towns with families. She stood abruptly, pacing the small space. Then Annie arrived, 6 years old, bright as a new penny. She reminded me of, her voice caught, of myself at that age, still believing the world was good. I couldn't let them take her. So you started investigating, Jack prompted gently. I worked in the office sometimes, filing papers, started noticing discrepancies. Children listed as adopted, but no family names recorded. Money coming in from sources that made no sense for a charity institution. Rose pressed her fingers to her temples, concentrating. Then I found it, a hidden ledger behind the main files. Names, dates, amounts paid, destinations. Where did they go? Jack asked, though he suspected he knew. Everywhere they shouldn't, Rose said flatly. Mining camps needing small bodies for narrow shafts. Saloons wanting young girls to work. Factories back east. Even some private homes wanting servants they didn't have to pay. Her hands clenched into fists. Children sold like cattle. Jack and everyone in authority getting their cut. Sadie stirred in her sleep, and Rose lowered her voice. I copied what I could, hid the original ledger. I was going to take it to the federal marshal in Cheyenne. Garrett had the local law in his pocket. But somehow, he found out. The fire, Jack said. Rose sank back into her chair. It started in the middle of the night, the whole East Wing where the youngest children slept. I tried God, how I tried to get to them, but Garrett's men held me back, made me watch. Tears ran freely down her face now. 2 children died. Timothy, who was 8 and wanted to be a soldier. Mary, who was 5 and afraid of the dark. They died because I waited too long, because I wanted more evidence, because I was a coward. Stop! Jack reached across the table, taking her hands in his. You were 17 years old, alone, fighting against powerful men. You did more than most would have dared. After the fire, they blamed me, said I'd started it in a fit of madness, that my father's death had unhinged my mind. They had witnesses other staff members Garrett owned. I was to be sent to an asylum. Rose laughed bitterly. Another institution Garrett had arrangements with, no doubt. But you escaped. The night before the transfer, I retrieved the ledger from where I'd hidden it under an old sycamore outside the fence. But they caught me before I could get far, beat me, tied me up, threw me in that sack. She shuddered. I heard them talking. They were supposed to take me out to the prairie, make sure I never surfaced again. But one of them young fellow, maybe having second thoughts, he just dumped me by those trees near your town. Probably figured I'd die anyway. Thank God for guilty consciences, Jack murmured. I must have crawled toward town, toward the tree that reminded me of where I'd hidden the ledger. Then, nothing, until I woke in your barn. Rose wiped her eyes. The ledger, if it's still there, if we could get it. It's evidence, Jack finished. Real evidence that could bring them all down. It's near Willow Springs, about 60 miles north, but Finch will expect us to run further, not head back toward danger. Jack considered. Tom Harmon was keeping watch outside, the minister was gathering information, and they had friends working in town. It was risky, but... We'll go, he decided. Tonight, after dark. Tom can create a diversion. Make Finch think we're headed for Montana. Rose gripped his hands tighter. Jack, you don't have to... Yes, he said firmly. I do. You're family now. Rose, both you and those children who died deserve justice. A soft voice from the bunk made them both turn. I want to help too, Sadie said, sitting up with sleep-mussed hair. Neither had realized she was awake. Sweetheart, this is dangerous, Rose began. So was staying in the barn when that mean man came, Sadie interrupted with 4-year-old logic. But we did it anyway because it was right. Papa taught me that doing right isn't always safe. Jack felt his throat tighten with pride and fear in equal measure. Out of the mouths of babes, he murmured. They spent the day preparing. Tom Harmon came and went, bringing supplies and news. Finch was searching the northern routes as expected, furious at losing his quarry. The minister's telegrams had borne fruit, seems. Hollow Creek had quite a reputation among church reformers. None of it good. As darkness fell, they mounted up again. Tom would ride north, leaving an obvious trail, then double back. Billy would stay in town, ready to telegraph their findings to federal authorities once they had the ledger. The ride to Willow Springs took most of the night. They stopped only to rest the horses and for Jack to scout ahead. Rose grew quieter the closer they got, memories pressing down like physical weight. There, she whispered as dawn approached. That grove of sycamores by the old well. They dismounted, and Rose led them to a massive tree, its trunk scarred by time. I carved a mark, she said, running her hands over the bark. Here. Jack pulled out his knife and began digging where she indicated. The ground was hard-packed, but finally the blade hit something that wasn't earth. Carefully, he extracted an oilcloth bundle. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, water-stained but intact. Rose opened it with shaking hands, revealing page after page of damning entries, names, dates, money received, destinations, a complete record of Garrett's trafficking empire. Look, Rose pointed to one entry. Annie Morrison. That's the little girl I tried to protect, sold to a domestic placement in Denver 2 days before the fire. Her voice hardened. She might still be alive. Jack, some of them might be saved. A branch cracked behind them. Jack spun, pushing Rose and Sadie behind him, rifle raised. Well. Darius Finch stepped from the shadows, his own weapon trained on them. I thought you might come back here. Criminals always return to the scene, don't they? The only criminal here is the man you're working for. Jack said evenly. Finch's smile was cold. Garrett pays well for problems to disappear. Though I must admit, you've led me quite a chase. How many children have disappeared because of you? Rose stepped out from behind Jack, the ledger clutched to her chest. How many families destroyed? I don't ask questions. Finch replied, I just clean up messes. And you, my dear, are a considerable mess. Papa, Sadie whispered, pressing close to Jack's leg. The fear in his daughter's voice sparked something primal in Jack. You're not taking them, he said, his voice deadly quiet. Not Rose, not the ledger, not anything. 3 against 1, Finch laughed. A has-been cowboy, a mad woman, and a child I faced down worse. Have you faced down this? Tom Harmon's voice came from behind Finch. The deputy stepped into view, his rifle steady. Drop the weapon. Finch! Finch's eyes darted, calculating. Then, quick as a snake, he spun toward Tom. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Finch cried out, his gun flying from his hand as he clutched his shoulder. Tom's shot had been true, wounding but not killing. That's enough, Tom said calmly. You're under arrest for attempted murder, conspiracy, and about a dozen other charges once we get this sorted. As Tom secured the wounded Finch, Rose sank to her knees, clutching the ledger. It's over, she whispered. It's really over. Jack knelt beside her, pulling both her and Sadie into his arms. The first part is, he corrected gently. Now we make sure justice gets done. They returned to Red Willow as the sun climbed high. Word had already spread Tom had telegraphed ahead. A federal marshal was on his way from Cheyenne. The ledger would be evidence. Garrett and his entire operation would be investigated. But for now, Jack was content to sit on his own porch, watching Sadie show Rose her collection of pretty rocks while the afternoon light painted everything gold. You saved those children, he told Rose quietly. The ones still alive, they'll be found because of you. The ones who died, they'll have justice. Rose leaned against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that would have been unthinkable weeks ago. We saved them, she corrected. I couldn't have done any of this alone. Mama Rose, Sadie called from the yard. Look, this rock has sparkles. Rose smiled, the expression transforming her face. I see it, sweetheart. Jack watched them, his daughter and this woman who'd arrived broken but refused to stay that way. Tomorrow would bring federal marshals and lawyers and probably more danger before it was done. But today, they were home. What are you thinking? Rose asked, noticing his contemplative mood. I'm thinking, Jack said slowly, that sometimes the worst moments in our lives lead to the best. If Martha hadn't died, I wouldn't have been alone that morning. If you hadn't been hurt, you wouldn't have needed saving. If Sadie hadn't lost her mother, she wouldn't have recognized you. God's arithmetic, Rose murmured, remembering his earlier words. Something like that, Jack agreed, as the sun set over the Wyoming plains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold. 3 people who'd been broken in different ways sat together on a porch in Red Willow. They were battered and weary, but they were whole. They were family. And somewhere, in records that would soon be examined, were the names of children who might yet come home because one woman refused to let their stories end in darkness. The ledger sat on the table inside, its secrets finally in the light. Justice would be slower than any of them wished, but it would come. For now, though, there was peace, there was hope, there was home. The morning sun cast long shadows across Main Street as a small crowd gathered outside the sheriff's office. Word had spread like wildfire through Red Willow. Federal marshals were coming. The woman Jack Rollins had saved was actually some kind of hero, and there was talk of a trafficking ring that reached all the way to Denver. Jack stood on his porch, watching the dust cloud approaching from the east. 3 riders, the federal marshal and his deputies, no doubt, beside him. Rose gripped the porch railing, her knuckles white. It'll be all right, he said quietly. They have a warrant. Jack, for Rebecca Hartley. For murder. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the fear underneath. They have Garrett's warrant, Jack corrected. Based on lies, we have the truth. Sadie burst through the door, wearing her Sunday dress. Mama Rose, Mrs. Morrison says you should wear the blue dress. She says it makes you look spectable. Despite everything, Rose smiled. Respectable, sweetheart, and thank Mrs. Morrison for me. As Rose went inside to change, Jack knelt before his daughter. Sadie, today might be hard. People might say things about Rose that aren't true. I know, Sadie said solemnly. But we'll tell them what is true, that she saved children and bad men hurt her for it. Jack hugged her tight. That's my brave girl. The riders reached the sheriff's office, and Jack saw Tom Harmon emerge to greet them. After a brief conference, the whole group turned toward Jack's house, time to face whatever came. But as they approached, Jack noticed something unexpected half the town seemed to be following. Mrs. Morrison was there, and Reverend Carter, Billy, the blacksmith Jonas, even old Sam from the general store. They formed a loose semicircle in Jack's yard, facing the lawmen. The lead marshal, a weathered man with keen eyes, dismounted. Mr. Rollins, I'm Federal Marshal Frank Morrison. I understand you're harboring Rebecca Hartley. I'm giving shelter to a woman who exposed child trafficking, Jack replied evenly. A woman who was nearly murdered for trying to save children. Marshal Morrison's expression didn't change. I have a warrant for her arrest on charges of arson and murder, and I have evidence that those charges are false. Jack held up the ledger. Names, dates, money trails, proof that Horace Garrett has been selling children for profit. A murmur ran through the crowd. The marshal's eyes sharpened. That's a serious accusation. It's not an accusation, Rose said, stepping onto the porch. She wore Mrs. Morrison's blue dress, her hair pinned neatly, looking every inch the respectable woman she truly was. It's the truth, and I'm prepared to testify to it. Marshal Morrison, but not as a criminal, as a witness. The marshal studied her for a long moment. Then, ma'am, I have a legal warrant. I'm obligated to serve it. Then serve it, Rose said, stepping forward. Arrest me, but know that in doing so, you're serving the interests of child traffickers and murderers. Now, hold on. Tom Harmon interjected. Frank, we've known each other for years. You know I wouldn't stand behind this if I hadn't looked into it thoroughly. Finch has confessed. Reverend Carter added, He's in our jail right now, willing to testify about Garrett's operations in exchange for leniency. The crowd began to speak up, voices overlapping. She prayed in my church. That's not a guilty woman. My cousin's boy disappeared from that orphanage 3 years ago. If Jack Rollins vouches for her, that's good enough for me. Marshal Morrison raised a hand for silence. Mrs. Hartley. Rollins. Rose interrupted quietly. My name is Rose Rollins now. She glanced at Jack, then back at the marshal. Or it will be, if you'll allow me to stay free long enough to marry. Jack's heart stopped. They'd never discussed this, never. She's my mama. Sadie pushed through the crowd to stand defiantly before the marshal. She's my mama, and you can't take her. An elderly woman Jack recognized as Mrs. Weatherby, who'd worked as a cook at Hollow Creek years ago, stepped forward on shaking legs. Marshal, I worked at that place. I saw what they did. This girl tried to stop it. The fire that killed those babies wasn't her doing, it was Garrett covering his tracks. I can confirm that, another voice called. A young man pushed forward, stranger to Jack, but his hollow eyes spoke of hard experience. My name's David Carson. I was at Hollow Creek until 2 years ago. Miss Rebecca, Miss Rose, she tried to help us, snuck us extra food, taught us to read when Garrett forbade it. When the fire started, she tried to save everyone. Garrett's men held her back. More voices rose, more testimonies. The marshal looked increasingly troubled. Marshall Morrison, Jack said, stepping forward. You have a choice. You can serve a warrant obtained through corruption and lies, or you can help us see justice done. What's it going to be? The marshal was silent for a long moment. Then he turned to his deputies. Secure that ledger as evidence. He looked back at Rose. Ma'am, I'm placing you under protective custody as a material witness. You'll need to come to Cheyenne to give a deposition, but you won't be held as a criminal. Relief washed through the crowd. Rose sagged against Jack, who wrapped an arm around her shoulders. However, the marshal continued, this is a federal matter now. We'll need comprehensive statements from everyone involved. He paused, then added with the ghost of a smile, including any marriage plans that might affect the witness's legal name. The crowd began to disperse, people patting Jack's shoulder, squeezing Rose's hand, ruffling Sadie's hair. The immediate crisis had passed, but Jack knew the real work was just beginning. Did you mean it? He asked Rose quietly as the yard emptied. About the name? She turned to face him fully, gray eyes serious. I shouldn't have presumed. I know we haven't. That is, you haven't. Rose. He cupped her face gently. I was planning to ask properly. After all this was settled, after you felt safe. I feel safe now, she whispered. With you, I feel safe. Papa, Sadie tugged at his pants leg. Are you gonna ask her? Jack laughed, the tension of the morning finally breaking. He looked around at the marshal conferring with Tom, at the townspeople still lingering, at Mrs. Morrison beaming from her doorway. Then he did something he'd never imagined doing. He dropped to one knee right there in his dusty yard. Rose Rebecca, whoever you choose to be, he began. You came into our lives like a storm, turned everything upside down, and somehow made it all better. Sadie loves you. I love you. Will you marry us? Will you be my wife and her mother and whatever else the future brings? Rose's hands flew to her mouth, tears streaming. Jack Rollins, you impossible man, yes, yes to all of it. The yard erupted in cheers. Sadie launched herself at Rose, who caught her and spun her around. Jack stood, grinning like a fool, and pulled both of them close. Well, Marshall Morrison said dryly, I suppose I should wait to take my witness to Cheyenne until after the wedding. Wouldn't want to separate newlyweds. Frank Morrison, you old romantic. Tom Harmon laughed. When did you go soft? When I realized I was about to arrest a woman for the crime of trying to save children, the marshal replied soberly. This job's hard enough without persecuting heroes. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Reverend Carter agreed to perform the ceremony that very evening. No sense waiting when you've already faced down death together. Mrs. Morrison marshaled the town's women into a frenzy of preparation. Someone found a white dress that had belonged to the late banker's daughter. Someone else contributed a veil. The church was decorated with late wildflowers and whatever else could be gathered. As the sun set, Jack stood at the altar in his best suit, the one he'd worn to marry Martha, now witnessing a different kind of love. Not a replacement, but a continuation, a new chapter. Sadie stood beside him as the world's youngest best man, clutching the ring they'd borrowed from Mrs. Morrison. The church was packed, the whole town turning out to witness this triumph over tragedy. Then Rose appeared, and Jack forgot how to breathe. She was radiant, the borrowed dress fitting as if made for her, but it was her expression that caught him joy mixed with wonder, as if she couldn't quite believe this was real. She reached him, and he took her hands. They were steady now, no longer trembling as they had that first day. Dearly beloved, Reverend Carter began. We are gathered here to witness something remarkable, not just a union of two people, but a testament to the power of compassion over cruelty, of love over law when law serves injustice. The ceremony was simple, the vows traditional with one addition. When it came time for Sadie to give the ring, she piped up, I want to promise too. The Reverend, hiding a smile, nodded. Go ahead, child. Sadie looked up at Rose seriously. I promise to love you forever and show you all my favorite places and teach you to make Papa's special pancakes and never let anybody take you away again. There wasn't a dry eye in the church. By the power vested in me, Reverend Carter concluded, his own voice suspiciously thick. I now pronounce you husband and wife. Jack, you may kiss your bride. The kiss was gentle, appropriate for the setting, but it held promises of deeper intimacy to come. The church erupted in applause as they turned to face their community, their family as husband and wife. Jack caught sight of Marshal Morrison in the back row. The federal agent nodded once, a gesture of respect and understanding. Tomorrow would bring depositions and trials and the long work of justice. Children would need to be found and returned to families. Garrett and his network would need to be dismantled. Rose would have to relive painful memories in courtrooms. But tonight, there was dancing in the church hall. There was Sadie standing on Jack's feet as they waltzed. Rose laughing as Jonas the blacksmith spun her around. There was cake and fiddle music and stories told around tables laden with food. No regrets, Jack asked as they finally found a moment alone on the church steps, watching stars appear in the clear Wyoming sky. How could I regret the path that brought me here? Rose replied, leaning into his warmth. Every terrible thing led to this moment. To you, to Sadie, to home. Papa, Mama, Sadie ran up, cake crumbs on her dress. Mrs. Morrison says it's time for the chivalry. Jack groaned as the traditional wedding night ruckus began pots banging, people shouting good-natured ribaldry. Rose laughed, the sound free and unguarded. Is this normal? She asked. Nothing about us has been normal, Jack replied, sweeping her up in his arms as the crowd cheered. Why start now? He carried her toward their wagon, decorated with ribbons and flowers and probably a few practical jokes courtesy of the younger men. Sadie ran alongside, her flower crown askew, face bright with joy. As they drove away from the church, the chivalry following for a bit before good sense and respect let them be. Rose looked back at the town that had become her salvation. Thank you, she whispered, though whether to God or Jack or the universe itself, even she wasn't sure. No, Jack said, his voice rough with emotion. Thank you. For surviving, for fighting, for choosing us. The road home stretched before them, lit by stars and hope and the promise of tomorrow. Behind them, Red Willow settled into sleep, satisfied with the night's work. Justice had been served, but more than that, love had won. And in a small house on the edge of town, 3 people who'd been broken in different ways would wake tomorrow as a family, whole and healing and ready to face whatever came next. The morning after their wedding dawned crisp and clear. Jack woke to find Rose already up, standing by the window in Martha's old robe, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold. Couldn't sleep, he asked softly. Too much happiness, she replied, turning to smile at him. I keep thinking I'll wake up back in that sack, that all of this was just a fever dream. Jack rose and went to her, wrapping his arms around her from behind. It's real. You're here. You're safe. You're my wife. Your wife, she repeated wonderingly. Rose Rollins. She leaned back against him. Today we go to dig up the truth. Literally. They'd arranged to meet Marshal Morrison and his deputies at the Sycamore Grove, where Rose had first hidden the ledger. She was certain there were other documents buried there, papers her father had given her before his death, evidence he'd gathered about Hollow Creek's operations. After breakfast, with Sadie safely in Mrs. Morrison's care, they rode out with Tom Harmon and the federal men. Rose led them to the same massive sycamore, but this time to the opposite side. Papa taught me to always keep backups, she said, kneeling by a distinctive rock. He said truth was too important to trust to just one hiding place. They dug carefully, Jack's heart racing with each scoop of earth. Then contact, another oilcloth bundle, larger than the first. Inside were letters, medical records, bank statements, and a journal in a man's careful hand. Doctor, Marcus Hartley had been thorough in his investigation. My God, Marshal Morrison breathed as he examined the documents. This goes back years. Garrett wasn't the first he took over an existing operation. And look at these names. Judge Willoughby in Denver. Senator Crane's brother. This is big, Tom Harmon finished grimly. Bigger than we thought. Rose was reading her father's journal, tears streaming down her face. He knew they were going to kill him, she whispered. He wrote, If something happens to me, Rebecca, take these papers to federal authorities. Don't trust local law. They own them all. But you were just a child, Jack said gently. 10 years old, Rose confirmed. I tried to do what he said, but they caught me first, made me disappear. She looked up at the marshal. Some of these children might still be alive, in the mining camps, in the factories. We have to find them. Marshal Morrison nodded gravely. We will. This is evidence of interstate trafficking. I'll need to telegraph Washington immediately. We'll need more men, more resources. He paused. Mrs. Rollins, are you prepared for what's coming? Trials, testimony. Powerful men who won't go down without a fight. I've been preparing for 17 years. Rose replied steadily. I'm ready. They returned to town to find it buzzing with activity. Word of the additional evidence had somehow already spread. Small towns had their ways. But there was also disturbing news 3 strangers had ridden in. Well-dressed men asking questions about Rose. Garrett's lawyers, most like, Tom said, coming to Muddy Waters. But when the strangers appeared at Jack's door that afternoon, they weren't what anyone expected. The lead man, silver-haired and dignified, removed his hat politely. Mrs. Rollins, my name is Theodore Ashford. I was a friend of your father's. We were at medical college together. Rose gripped Jack's hand. Doctor, Ashford Papa mentioned you in his letters. When I heard about the investigation, about a young woman named Rebecca Hartley testifying, the man's voice cracked. We thought you were dead. We held a memorial service. The other 2 men were introduced as fellow doctors who'd known Marcus Hartley. They'd brought more evidence correspondence with Rose's father about his concerns. Medical examinations he'd performed on children who'd escaped from Hollow Creek, showing signs of severe neglect and abuse. We should have done more. Doctor, Ashford said heavily. When Marcus died, we were cowards. We let fear silence us. You're here now, Rose said simply. That's what matters. That evening, the sheriff's office became an impromptu war room. Maps were spread on tables, marking locations mentioned in the ledgers. Lists were compiled of children who'd disappeared, cross-referenced with the records of where they'd been sent. The Garrison Mine in Colorado, Marshal Morrison pointed. According to this, they purchased 12 children over 3 years, all listed as orphans with no family to inquire after them. The Westwood Textile Factory in Kansas, another deputy added. 23 children, all girls between 10 and 14. Each name was a weight, each entry a life stolen. Rose worked tirelessly, her memory proving remarkable once unleashed. She recalled faces, names, little details that helped build the case. Timothy loved birds, she said, pointing to one entry. He'd whistle to them every morning, made even the saddest children smile. Her voice caught. He died in the fire. He was trying to get the little ones out. Jack stayed beside her through it all, steady as a rock. When she faltered, he was there. When the memories became too much, he'd guide her outside for air, for quiet moments under the stars. On the 3rd day, the first telegraph came through the Garrison Mine had been raided. 7 children found, all alive though bearing the marks of hard labor. They'd be brought to Cheyenne for care and identification. Rose wept at the news, tears of joy and sorrow mixed. 7, she whispered. 7 saved. With more to come. Marshal Morrison assured her, the Kansas factory is next. As the week progressed, more news arrived. More raids, more children found. Not all had survived the years of servitude, but many had, and with each rescue, the net tightened around those who'd profited from their suffering. Garrett himself was arrested trying to flee to Mexico. Senator Crane's brother was taken into custody in Denver. Judge Willoughby was found dead in his study, self-inflicted, the report said, rather than face justice. But with progress came danger. One night, Jack woke to the sound of breaking glass. He grabbed his rifle and crept to the window to see two men trying to force the barn door. "Rose," he whispered urgently. "Take Sadie to the root cellar. Now." She didn't argue. Gathering the sleeping child and slipping out the back, Jack made his way outside, using shadows for cover. The men were professionals, that much was clear from how they moved. Hired guns, probably. Sent to silence the star witness. But they'd underestimated one thing: this was Jack's land, and he knew every inch of it. He circled wide, coming up behind them. "Drop the weapons," he commanded. They spun, guns raising, but Jack was already moving. 2 shots, 2 men down wounded. Not killed. He wasn't a murderer, no matter what they'd come to do. Tom Harmon and half the town arrived within minutes. Misses. Morrison's nephew had been keeping watch and raised the alarm. The hired guns were taken into custody, and by morning they'd confessed who'd sent them a group of investors who stood to lose fortunes if their involvement in child trafficking was exposed. "Are you all right?" Rose asked, checking Jack over for injuries as dawn broke. "I'm fine," he assured her, then pulled both her and Sadie into a fierce embrace. "But I think it's time we considered that offer from Marshal Morrison." The marshal had suggested moving them to Cheyenne temporarily, where federal protection could be better assured. Rose had resisted, not wanting to uproot Sadie or leave their new home. But now, "Just until the trials are over," Jack said. "Then we come home." Rose nodded slowly. "Together. Always together." They spent one more day in Red Willow, arranging for the ranch's care, saying goodbyes. The town turned out to see them off, pressing gifts and good wishes on them. Even crusty old Sam from the general store had tears in his eyes. "You come back. You hear, Mrs.?" Morrison said fiercely, hugging Rose tight. "This town needs people like you." As their wagon rolled away, escorted by federal marshals, Sadie asked, "Will we really come back, Papa?" "We will," Jack promised. "Red Willow is our home." "Good," Sadie said decisively, "because I left my best rocks buried by the creek, and Mama needs to see them bloom." Rose looked puzzled. "Bloom?" "She thinks if you bury pretty rocks, they grow into more rocks," Jack explained, smiling. "Been trying it since she was 3. "Well," Rose said, pulling Sadie close, "stranger things have happened. After all, they buried me, and I bloomed into your mama." It was a silly joke, born of exhaustion and stress, but it made them all laugh. And as they rode toward Cheyenne and the trials ahead, that laughter was armor against the darkness they'd face. Behind them, the work continued. More children found, more criminals arrested. The network that had operated for decades was finally crumbling, all because one woman had refused to forget, refused to give up, refused to let evil win. And in a wagon rolling across the Wyoming plains, a family forged in crisis held tight to each other and to hope. They would testify, they would see justice done, and then they would go home, to a little ranch outside Red Willow, where rocks might not bloom but love certainly did. The evening star appeared on the horizon, bright and steady. Rose pointed it out to Sadie, who immediately began making up a story about it. Jack listened to their voices mixing with the creak of wagon wheels and the whisper of wind through grass, and knew that whatever tomorrow brought, they'd face it as they'd faced everything else together. "Look, Papa," Sadie called. "The star's following us." "No, sweetheart," Rose corrected gently. "We're following it. It's leading us toward what's right." Jack met his wife's eyes over their daughter's head and saw his own thoughts reflected there. They were following a star indeed, the star of justice, of hope, of family built from the ashes of tragedy. and wherever it led, they'd follow it together. The snow had melted, leaving the hills around Red Willow dressed in the tender green of early spring. Jack stood by the newly repaired fence, watching Rose and Sadie plant wildflower seeds along the border of their property. 6 months had passed since the trials in Cheyenne. 6 months since justice had finally been served. "Papa, look," Sadie called, holding up a particularly large seed. "This one's special. I'm going to plant it right where we found Mama." Jack's throat tightened, as it always did when he remembered that morning finding Rose near death in a burlap sack. Now she knelt in the same spot, her hands deep in the earth, planting new life where death had once threatened. The trials had been grueling. Rose had testified for days, her voice steady as she recounted the horrors of Hollow Creek. The evidence had been overwhelming: the ledgers, her father's notes, the testimonies of rescued children. One by one, the guilty had fallen. Garrett was serving life in federal prison. His network had been dismantled, its tentacles cut away from the vulnerable children it had fed upon. 37 children had been recovered alive from various locations. Not all could be reunited with families. Some had no families left, but new homes had been found. Real homes with people who'd been thoroughly vetted. Rose had insisted on being part of that process, traveling to meet each child, to assure them that their nightmare was over. "The nightmares still come sometimes," she told Jack one night in Cheyenne. "But then I wake up and you're there, and Sadie's there, and I remember that good one." Now, back home in Red Willow, they were building something new on the foundation of their shared strength. The town had welcomed them back as heroes, though Rose shied away from that word. "I just did what anyone should have done," she'd say when people tried to thank her. But Jack knew better. He'd seen the cost of her courage in her sleepless nights, in the way loud noises still made her flinch, in how tightly she held Sadie when the child had bad dreams. Heroes, he'd learned, were just people who kept fighting despite their scars. "Riders coming," Rose said, shading her eyes against the morning sun. Jack tensed automatically. Old habits died hard, then relaxed as he recognized Mrs. Morrison's nephew Billy, accompanied by a young woman he didn't know. "Mr. Rollins, Mrs." "Rollins!" Billy called out, dismounting with his usual enthusiasm. "Got someone here wants to meet you." The young woman dismounted more slowly, her movements careful and dignified despite her obvious nervousness. She couldn't have been more than 20, with auburn hair and eyes that held too much knowledge for her age. "My name is Annie Morrison," she said softly. I was at Hollow Creek. Mrs. Rollins, Rose, you tried to save me." Rose's hand flew to her mouth. "Annie, little Annie with the braids who loved to sing." The young woman nodded, tears streaming. "You taught me my letters. You told me to be brave. When they took me away, you tried to stop them." Rose was across the yard in seconds, pulling Annie into a fierce embrace. "I looked for you," she whispered. "In all the records. I looked. They said you went to Denver, but the trail went cold." "A family there took me in," Annie explained, her voice muffled against Rose's shoulder. "Good people who didn't know where I'd really come from. They raised me as their own. When I read about the trials in the papers, when I saw your name." She pulled back to look at Rose. "I had to come, to thank you, to tell you that I survived because of what you taught me." They moved to the porch, where Annie told her story. The family in Denver had been kind, giving her education and opportunities. She was engaged now, to a young banker who knew her history and loved her anyway. She'd come to Red Willow not just to thank Rose, but to help. "I've been in contact with some of the other survivors," Annie explained. "We want to start a fund to help children who have nowhere to go. Real help, not another institution. Maybe apprenticeships or scholarships, or just safe places to stay while they find their feet." "That's wonderful," Rose breathed. "Your father would have loved that idea, using education and opportunity to break the cycle." They talked until the sun was high, making plans. Annie would return to Denver but stay in touch. The fund would be named for Dr. Marcus Hartley and the two children who died in the fire, Timothy and Mary, ensuring their memories lived on and every child helped. After Annie left, promising to write, the family settled into their evening routine. Jack had expanded the house over the winter, adding a proper bedroom for Sadie and a small study where Rose could work on her correspondence with other survivor advocates. "Papa," Sadie said over dinner, "Miss Annie was sad even though she was smiling." "Sometimes people can be both," Rose explained gently. "Happy for what they have now, sad for what they lost." "Like you and Papa." Jack and Rose exchanged glances. Their daughter saw so much. "Yes," Jack said, "like us, but the happiness is stronger than the sadness now." "Good," Sadie declared, "because tomorrow's the spring festival and I want to win the pie contest." The next day, Red Willow burst into celebration. The spring festival was a tradition going back to the town's founding, a celebration of surviving winter and welcoming new growth. This year felt especially meaningful. Rose had indeed made a pie-apple from the cellar stores with Sadie's enthusiastic help. They joined the crowds on Main Street, where bunting fluttered in the warm breeze and fiddle music filled the air. "Jack Rollins," Judge McKay called out. "Heard you're thinking of running for sheriff come fall." Jack glanced at Rose, who smiled encouragingly. They'd discussed it over the winter. Tom Harmon was ready to retire, and the town needed someone they trusted. Thinking about it, Jack admitted, "Good man. We need men who understand that law and justice aren't always the same thing." As they wandered among the booths and games, Jack noticed how people looked at Rose now, not with suspicion or pity, but with respect. She'd become a pillar of the community, teaching Sunday school, helping Doc Weatherby with his rounds, being the person others turned to when they needed strength. The pie contest was judged at noon. Sadie stood on tiptoe as Reverend Carter tasted each entry with a solemn concentration. When he announced Rose's pie as the winner, Sadie's whoop of joy could be heard clear to the edge of town. "Your mama makes good pie," old Sam commented, presenting Rose with the blue ribbon. "She makes good everything," Sadie informed him seriously. "Even good from bad things." That evening, as the sun set over the mountains, Jack found himself standing once again at the spot where it all began. The sycamore tree spread its branches overhead, new leaves whispering in the breeze. Rose stood beside him, the blue ribbon pinned to her dress. Sadie dancing around them with sparklers Billy had brought from Cheyenne. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't found you that morning?" Jack asked. Rose considered, then shook her head. "No, because you did find me. That's what matters." She leaned against his shoulder. "Though I sometimes wonder what would have happened if Sadie hadn't said what she did, that I was her mama." "She saw the truth before either of us did," Jack said, watching their daughter chase fireflies. "Children do that sometimes." "Papa, Mama, look." Sadie had caught a firefly in her cupped hands, its light glowing through her fingers. "It's like catching a star." "Gentle now," Rose cautioned. "Let it go so it can find its family." Sadie opened her hands, and they watched the firefly spiral upward, blinking its tiny light until it vanished among its fellows. "Everything finds its way home eventually," Rose murmured. "Yes," Jack agreed, pulling his family close. "It does." As they walked back to their house, expanded now, but still the same home where Jack had grieved and healed, where Sadie had grown from toddler to child, where Rose had found her way back to herself, the stars began to appear overhead. "Tell me the story again," Sadie requested as they settled on the porch. "About how you found Mama." It had become a bedtime tradition, this retelling, but Rose took over tonight, her voice soft in the darkness. "Once upon a time, there was a little girl who got lost. She was lost for so long she forgot who she was. But then a brave cowboy and his clever daughter found her, and they remembered for her until she could remember for herself." Jack listened to his wife spin their truth into a fairy tale for their daughter, watched the evening star rise over the mountains, and felt a deep contentment settle in his bones. They'd all been lost in their own ways, he in grief, Rose in trauma, Sadie in loneliness. But they'd found each other, and in finding each other, had found themselves. "And they lived happily ever after?" Sadie asked sleepily. "They lived," Rose corrected gently, "with all the happiness and sorrow and joy and pain that living brings. But they lived it together, and that made all the difference." Sadie was asleep before the story ended, carried inside by Jack while Rose tidied the porch. When he returned, she was holding the blue ribbon, running her thumb over the silk. "My father would have been proud," she said quietly. "Not of the pie, he was a terrible cook, but of this, of building something good from something terrible." "He would have been proud of you," Jack corrected. "Of the woman you've become, the mother, the wife, the advocate." "The winner of the Red Willow Spring Festival Pie Contest," Rose added with a small smile. "That too," Jack laughed, pulling her into his arms. They stood together on the porch of their home, in the town that had become their haven, under stars that had witnessed their journey from stranger to family. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, always did in the West. But tonight, with their daughter safe in bed and the night peaceful around them, they had everything they needed. "I love you, Jack Rollins," Rose said against his chest. "And I love you, Rose Rollins," he replied. "Thank you for surviving. Thank you for fighting. Thank you for choosing us." "Thank you," she whispered back, "for believing a broken woman could be made whole, that a family could be built from sorrow, that love could grow where only pain had been planted." Inside, they could hear Sadie talking in her sleep, mumbling about fireflies and pie ribbons. Outside, a coyote called in the distance, answered by another. The world turned on, full of darkness and light in equal measure. But here, in this small corner of Wyoming, in a house built by hope and maintained by love, three people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances rested in the peace they'd earned. They were home. They were family. They were whole. And under the same sycamore tree where it all began, new flowers bloomed in the spring earth, planted by hands that had learned to create instead of destroy, to nurture instead of fear, to love instead of merely survive. The end came not with fanfare, but with quiet grace. Rose's pie ribbon hung in the kitchen next to Martha's old spoon. Sadie's drawings of their family covered the walls, and Jack's guns gathered dust because the only fights left were the gentle ones of daily life. They had traveled from darkness to light, from solitude to family, from a woman abandoned to die becoming the heart of a home. It was, as Rose had told Sadie, not exactly happily ever after. It was something better. It was happily ever present, built one day at a time, one choice at a time, one act of love at a time. And that, in the end, was the greatest justice of all. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and exchange thoughts about this tale of hope and redemption in the Old West. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to Wild West Night and hit the like button. And don't forget to press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners who might need to hear that even in our darkest moments, love and justice can prevail. Until next time, partners, keep riding toward the light.